The following paper was submitted to this journal 14 months after the conclusion of the Accord-Earth conflict. It has been reviewed by 3 independent peer committees. 2 committees recommended publication without revision. 1 committee recommended revision on the grounds that several passages exceed the emotional parameters appropriate to a scientific document. After deliberation, the editorial board overruled this objection. The board's position is as follows. If a researcher spends 847 days studying a species and emerges changed by the experience, documenting that change is not a failure of scientific method. It is data. Before this author departed for Earth, the Accord's xenological database contained 4,411 classified species profiles. Of these, 214 were classified as technologically emergent species that had developed or were developing interstellar capability within the past 5 centuries. The human species was assigned to this category upon initial contact. The emergent species framework was developed over 2,000 years of accumulated research. It is robust. It has predicted behavioral patterns accurately in 91.4% of documented cases. When applied to the humans, it predicted the following: rapid technology acquisition driven by competitive pressure, strong in-group loyalty combined with intergroup hostility, a transition period of approximately 200–400 standard years between planetary and interstellar civilization, in which social institutions would struggle to keep pace with technological development, and a characteristic vulnerability to exploitation by more established civilizations during this transition. The model was wrong, not partially wrong, structurally wrong, not because its methodology was flawed but because the humans are not a variation on the pattern the model was built to recognize. They are something the model was not designed to accommodate. This paper documents what they are instead. On the 4th day of the author's embedded placement, the author's research liaison, a human academic named Professor Tanaka Yuki, Department of Xenocultural Studies, University of Kyoto, took the author to a market. The author had been to markets on 11 other worlds. Markets are predictable environments, resource exchange operating on the logic of supply, demand, and individual advantage. The author expected to observe this. What the author observed was different. The transactions in the market were embedded in conversation. Each exchange was preceded by greeting, accompanied by discussion, and concluded with what the author can only describe as mutual satisfaction that appeared to extend beyond the material terms of the exchange. A seller who accepted a lower price did not appear to have lost. A buyer who paid more than strictly necessary did not appear to have been cheated. Both parties, in the majority of observed transactions, appeared to have received something that was not reflected in the price. Finding 1-2a. The human transaction is social before it is economic. Human resource exchange cannot be accurately modeled by utility maximization frameworks alone. The social value of the exchange, the relationship established, the trust created, the shared experience of fair dealing, is a real component of the transaction's value to both parties. Researchers who model human economic behavior without this component will produce consistently inaccurate predictions. Note the author notes that this finding was initially resisted by the economics subcommittee reviewing this paper. The author notes further that the subcommittee's objection was phrased as, "This sounds like it could be explained by long-term reputation effects." The author's response, "Yes, it could. The humans call that being a decent person. The terms are compatible." The Accord's military files on human aggression are accurate and should not be discarded. The humans are capable of extraordinary organized violence. Their military history is extensively documented, and the author has reviewed it in full. This paper does not dispute those findings. This paper adds the following: human aggression is not their primary behavioral mode. It is their most visible behavioral mode because violence is visible in ways that kindness is not. A battle is recorded. The three strangers who helped a child in a park on a Tuesday are not recorded anywhere. They happened repeatedly across every human city the author visited. They are simply not in any file. The author spent 847 days watching humans. The violence in the historical record, not present in this period since the war had ended, was dramatic and well documented. The daily, unremarkable practice of humans assisting one another was neither dramatic nor documented. It was simply constant. Accord intelligence on human behavior is systematically skewed toward the observable extreme. Military action is documented. Casual care is not. Any strategic or diplomatic assessment built on this documentation will therefore overestimate human aggression and underestimate human cooperation. The author recommends that all existing human behavioral profiles be reviewed with this bias in mind. The emergent species model predicts strong in-group loyalty and weak out-group cooperation. In humans, the in-group boundary is not fixed. The author observed it expand and contract depending on context, with the reliable pattern that perceived need in another being tends to expand it. The author documented 312 separate instances of humans extending assistance, resources, or care to individuals outside their established social group. In 247 of these instances, the recipient was a stranger. In 19 instances, the recipient was a member of a species other than human, including on 3 occasions a member of the Accord's own species. The upper limit of the human circle of concern has not been located. The lower limit of what will trigger it appears to be visible need combined with the physical ability to help. This is not ideology. The author observed it in children too young to have been taught it as a value. It appears to precede instruction. Note peer reviewer flagged this finding as overstated. The reviewer cited human history's extensive record of in-group exclusion and out-group harm as counter-evidence. The author agrees this record exists and does not dispute it. The author's position is that both things are true simultaneously, that humans are capable of remarkable cruelty to those they have categorized as outside their concern, and remarkable care for those they have categorized as within it, and that the more interesting scientific question is not which capacity is real, but what determines which one activates. The author's 847 days of observation suggest the determining factor is often very small. Parahuman humor has resisted formal classification for the duration of this study. The author is filing the following as an interim classification, acknowledging it is incomplete. Parahuman humor appears to be a response to the perception of incongruity, the gap between what is expected and what is, between the scale of something and its treatment, between the formal and the informal, between what is said and what is meant. When this gap is perceived, and when the perceiver feels safe enough to acknowledge it rather than threatened by it, laughter results. The author's most useful data point on this subject came from an accidental experiment on day 11. The author, in a formal meeting, was asked to introduce themselves. The author gave a precise scientific self-introduction. A human researcher then asked the author to say something unexpected. The author, intending to comply with what appeared to be a social request, stated a fact about Accord reproductive biology. The room laughed for what the author's chronometer recorded as 38 seconds. The author had not intended humor. The author had intended compliance. The gap between these two intentions, visible to everyone in the room except the author, was apparently very funny. What humans find funny reveals what they expected. When humans laugh at something the researcher said without intending to be funny, they are identifying a gap between the researcher's model of the situation and their own. The author recommends treating unexpected human laughter as a data point rather than a social inconvenience. It is usually pointing at something worth examining. The author is required, by the standards of this journal, to present findings in objective and reproducible terms. The author has done this to the best of their ability throughout this document. The author is also required, by the standards of honest scholarship, to report accurately. The following is reported accurately. On day 614, the author attended a performance of orchestral music in a concert hall in Vienna, Austria. The composer of the music performed has been dead for 232 years. The hall contained approximately 1,800 humans. They were silent for the duration of the performance. In a way, the author had not previously observed humans being silent, not the silence of the bored or the restrained, but the silence of people giving something their full attention because it deserves it. The music was written by a human who suffered considerably in their life, died young, and whose work was not fully recognized until after their death. The humans in the hall knew this. They sat in the dark and listened to the sound this dead person had made when they were alive and struggling, and the author observed on their faces, the faces of 1,800 people the author did not know, something the author does not have a clinical term for. The author will use the human term, grief, tender grief, the grief of being alive and knowing other things have not been and finding that their trace remains. The author was affected by this. The author notes this not as a finding but as a fact. The author entered this study believing that scientific objectivity required emotional distance from the subject. The author exits this study believing something different, that emotional distance from a subject as emotionally saturated as the human species produces not objectivity but blindness. You cannot understand what moves them without being willing to be moved. You cannot understand what they value without being willing to find it valuable. The author does not believe this compromises the scientific record of this paper. The author believes it is the scientific record. The author will now list, without extensive commentary, things the author did not expect to experience during this study that the author experienced. The author did not expect to look forward to dinner at Professor Tanaka's home, which became a standing weekly arrangement by day 90 and continued until the end of the study period. The author did not expect to learn to make a human dish called miso soup, and to make it correctly, and to find this satisfying in a way that the author cannot fully account for. The author did not expect a human child named Adiz, encountered briefly on day 203 through the veteran interview program, to ask the author to spell 14 alien species names for her personal research notebook, a notebook she carried specifically for this purpose at 9 years old, and for this interaction to remain in the author's recall as vividly as anything else in 847 days. The author did not expect, on the final day of the study, to feel that 847 days was not sufficient, that there was more, that there is always more with this species, and that this is not a frustration but the correct response to something genuinely inexhaustible. 847 days is insufficient. The author recommends a minimum of 1,500 days for any researcher intending to produce a complete behavioral profile. The author further recommends that complete be struck from the research objective entirely. A complete profile of the human species is not achievable. A thorough, honest, and continually revised one is. That is the appropriate goal. The human species is not well served by the existing xenological classification framework. They are not an emergent civilization in the standard sense. They are not a militaristic species in the standard sense. They are not a cooperative species in the standard sense. They are all of these things simultaneously, and the simultaneous nature of it is not a paradox to be resolved. It is the finding. They are a species that builds the same structures they burn down, and burns down the same structures they build, and learns from both processes, and produces art about both processes, and feeds each other at the same table where they argued yesterday, and carries bandages for strangers' children, and fills halls to hear music written by the dead, and asks aliens to spell species names into research notebooks. They are, the author will say directly, the most interesting thing the author has encountered in a career of looking for interesting things. The author does not expect this to be the scientific consensus. The author submits it as personal testimony alongside the scientific record, clearly labeled, easily separated if the reader prefers not to include it in their assessment. The author does not prefer to separate them. After 847 days, the author does not believe they can be.